In the summer of 1914, as Europe stumbled toward the most catastrophic war in human history, one man placed an advertisement in a London newspaper that would become the most famous recruitment notice ever written. Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success. 5,000 men responded. What followed was not just a journey into the Antarctic wilderness, but a descent into circumstances so desperate, so utterly hopeless, that survival itself would become the greatest victory any explorer had ever achieved. This is the story of Ernest Shackleton and the ship Endurance, a story of 28 men trapped at the bottom of the world, where the margin between life and death could be measured in degrees of temperature, spoonfuls of food, and the unbreakable will of a leader who refused to let a single man die on his watch. The primary chronicle of this extraordinary ordeal comes from multiple sources aboard the ship itself. Frank Worsley, the Endurance's captain, kept meticulous logs that would later guide one of the most miraculous small boat journeys in maritime history. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, captured haunting images that preserve the expedition's story in ice and shadow. Most remarkably, we have the journal of Ernest Shackleton himself, a man who wrote with the understanding that his words might serve as the final testimony of 28 souls lost in the white silence of Antarctica. Ernest Henry Shackleton entered the world on February 15, 1874, in County Kildare, Ireland, the second son of a family caught between worlds. His father, Henry, was an English Quaker who had moved to Ireland to establish a farm, carrying with him the plain-spoken faith and moral certainty of his ancestors. His mother, Henrietta Letitia Sophia Gavon, brought Irish warmth and a streak of restlessness that would mark her son's entire life. The Shackleton farm occupied that uncertain territory between the Anglo-Irish ascendancy and the Irish countryside, not quite belonging to either world, but drawing strength from both. Young Ernest grew up breathing the damp air of the Irish countryside, where stone walls divided fields of impossible green, and the Atlantic winds carried salt and stories in equal measure. The landscape of his childhood was one of boundaries, between field and bog, between the cultivated and the wild, between the known paths that led to market towns and the mysterious tracks that disappeared into mist. This was a geography that taught a boy that the most interesting places lay always just beyond the next hill. The Shackleton household was one of books and debate, where Henry's Quaker principles of plain dealing and personal responsibility mingled with Henrietta's love of poetry and adventure stories. Ernest absorbed both influences, the moral backbone that would make him incapable of abandoning a man in need, and the romantic imagination that would drive him to the ends of the earth in search of glory. His siblings would later remember him as the family storyteller, the boy who could transform a routine walk through the fields into an epic journey through uncharted territories. When Ernest was 10, the family moved to London, where Henry hoped to establish himself in medicine. The transition from the wide skies of Ireland to the smoke and fog of Victorian London was jarring for all the children, but particularly for Ernest. The city's rigid hierarchies and social conventions felt like prison walls to a boy accustomed to roaming freely across the countryside. At Dulwich College, a respectable school for the sons of the emerging middle class, Ernest proved himself a mediocre student, but a natural leader. His teachers noted his ability to inspire loyalty among his classmates, though they worried about his tendency to daydream during mathematics lessons. It was at Dulwich that Ernest first encountered the literature that would shape his vision of heroism. He devoured the adventure novels of Robert Louis Stevenson and the polar narratives of earlier explorers, staying up by candlelight to read accounts of men who had pushed into the unknown regions of the Arctic and Antarctic. These books painted exploration not as scientific endeavor, but as spiritual quest, a test of character that revealed what manner of man lay beneath the veneer of civilization. At 16, declaring himself finished with formal education, Ernest announced his intention to go to sea. His father, Practical Henry, arranged for him to be apprenticed to the Merchant Marine rather than the Royal Navy, a decision that would later prove crucial to Ernest's development. The merchant service was a rougher, more democratic world than the rigid hierarchies of the Navy. Here, promotion came through competence rather than connection, and a man's worth was measured by his ability to handle a ship in a storm rather than his mastery of social protocols. Ernest's first voyage took him aboard the Houghton Tower, bound for Chile. The ship was a typical merchant vessel of the era, iron-hulled, square-rigged, and utterly dependent on wind and weather for her progress. The crew were a mixture of seasoned seamen and ambitious young men like Ernest, all packed into cramped quarters and bound together by the shared experience of small spaces and vast horizons. For a boy who had chafed at the constraints of London society, the ship offered a different kind of freedom, the freedom that came from accepting the absolute authority of natural forces. The voyage around Cape Horn was Ernest's initiation into the brotherhood of men who had faced the Southern Ocean at its most savage. The Horn, where the Pacific and Atlantic meet in perpetual fury, was the graveyard of ships and the proving ground of sailors. Ernest later wrote of his first passage, "The sea was magnificent in its anger, and I understood for the first time that there were forces in this world against which human will meant nothing unless it was perfectly aligned with knowledge and preparation." The lesson would serve him well. During his years in the Merchant Marine, Ernest grew from a restless Irish boy into a formidable seaman. He learned navigation from captains who could find their position by the stars, seamanship from boatswains who had sailed every ocean on the globe, and leadership from his own mistakes and successes in handling men under stress. By the time he passed his examination for Master Mariner at 24, Ernest Shackleton had acquired the practical skills that would later keep 28 men alive in the most desperate circumstances imaginable. But practical skills were not enough to satisfy the romantic soul that burned within the competent mariner. Ernest needed a stage worthy of his ambitions, a challenge that would test not just his seamanship, but his very identity as a man. The opportunity came in 1901, when he learned of a new Antarctic expedition being organized by the Royal Geographical Society. Antarctica in 1901 was still largely unknown, a continent of rumor and speculation rather than mapped reality. The Great Ross Ice Shelf had been discovered 60 years earlier, but the interior remained as mysterious as the dark side of the moon. National pride, scientific curiosity, and personal ambition were combining to drive what historians would later call the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. The British, led by naval officer Robert Falcon Scott, were determined to claim the ultimate geographical prize, the South Pole itself. Ernest's application to join Scott's discovery expedition was initially rejected. He was a merchant marine officer, not a naval man, and the expedition organizers preferred the disciplined hierarchy of the Royal Navy. But Ernest's persistence, combined with his obviously robust physical condition and natural leadership abilities, eventually won him a place as third officer. When the Discovery sailed from London in August 1901, Ernest Shackleton was aboard, heading toward the white continent that would define the rest of his life. The Discovery expedition was Ernest's introduction to Antarctic conditions and to the complex personality of Robert Falcon Scott. Scott was everything Ernest was not, a product of the Royal Navy's disciplined tradition, methodical in his approach to exploration, and deeply committed to the scientific objectives of the expedition. The two men recognized each other's competence but never achieved the mutual understanding that makes for easy partnership. Scott appreciated Ernest's ability to maintain morale among the men and his willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments. Ernest respected Scott's technical competence and his unquestionable courage, but beneath the surface courtesy, fundamental differences in temperament and philosophy created tensions that would eventually explode into open conflict. The moment of crisis came during the expedition's attempt to reach the South Pole in 1902. Scott selected Ernest and Dr. Edward Wilson to accompany him on a journey southward across the Ross Ice Shelf, farther into the Antarctic interior than any human beings had ever traveled. The three men set out with dogs and sledges, carrying supplies for what they hoped would be a march to glory and geographical immortality. What followed was 93 days of suffering that nearly killed all three men. The dogs, poorly chosen and inadequately trained, began dying within days of departure. The men were forced to relay loads, walking the same ground 3 times to move their supplies forward, a soul-crushing routine that turned each mile of progress into 3 miles of exhaustion. The cold was beyond anything they had experienced. Temperatures that made breathing painful and turned sweat into ice crystals that lacerated the skin. Their food supplies, calculated for healthy men under normal conditions, proved inadequate for the enormous caloric demands of polar travel. By December, Ernest was showing signs of scurvy, the sailor's curse that had killed more polar explorers than storms or crevasses. His gums were bleeding, his joints ached constantly, and his strength was failing visibly. Scott, himself suffering but still functional, made the decision to turn back while they still had a chance of reaching the ship alive. On their farthest south, they had reached 82 degrees 17 minutes south, farther south than any human beings in history, but still nearly 500 miles from the pole. The return journey was a nightmare of failing health and dwindling supplies. Ernest's condition deteriorated daily, and there were times when Scott and Wilson doubted he would survive the march back to the ship. But Ernest's will proved stronger than his failing body. He forced himself to keep walking day after day through pain that would have broken many men. When they finally stumbled into Discovery's winter quarters in February 1903, all 3 men were shadows of their former selves, but all 3 were alive. The expedition's doctor pronounced Ernest unfit for further Antarctic service and recommended his immediate return to civilization. Scott agreed, and in March 1903, Ernest found himself aboard a relief ship heading north while his companions prepared for another year in the Antarctic. The separation was devastating to his pride. He had dreamed of Antarctic glory and had achieved nothing but the reputation of being the man who had to be sent home for his health. But failure, Ernest discovered, could be a more powerful teacher than success. During the long voyage back to England, he analyzed every aspect of the southern journey, identifying the mistakes that had nearly killed them all. The dogs had been wrongly chosen and poorly handled. The food had been inadequate in both quantity and quality. Most crucially, the leadership had been divided and uncertain. Scott had been too concerned with maintaining naval discipline and too little focused on the practical necessities of polar travel. What was needed, Ernest concluded, was a different kind of leader, someone who could combine technical competence with the kind of inspirational leadership that could hold men together through months of darkness and hardship. Ernest Shackleton was already beginning to envision himself as that leader. Back in London, Ernest threw himself into the life of a returned polar explorer. He married Emily Dorman, a woman who understood his restless nature and supported his dreams of returning to the Antarctic. He took positions in journalism and business, but his heart remained fixed on the White Continent. He began planning his own expedition, one that would prove his competence as a leader and achieve the geographical prize that Scott had failed to reach. The Nimrod expedition of 1907 to 1909 was Ernest's first independent command, and it established his reputation as one of the great polar leaders. Using ponies instead of dogs for transport, employing innovative food and equipment, and driving his men with a combination of inspiration and iron discipline, Ernest led a small party to within 97 miles of the South Pole, closer than any human beings had ever come to that ultimate geographical goal. But 97 miles might as well have been 900. Ernest made the agonizing decision to turn back while his men were still strong enough to survive the return journey. "Better a live donkey than a dead lion," he wrote in his journal. Though the decision tore at his soul, he had proved his competence as a leader, saved his men's lives, and achieved a new farthest south record. But the pole itself remained unconquered, and Ernest knew that his moment of opportunity was passing. The blow fell in December 1911, when news reached London that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had reached the South Pole. Worse yet, Robert Falcon Scott and his companions had perished on their return from the pole, having arrived 34 days after Amundsen only to discover that they were forever second. The tragedy of Scott's death overshadowed Amundsen's victory in British popular imagination. But for Ernest, the message was clear. The age of pole-seeking was over. If he wanted to return to Antarctica, he would need a different objective, a new challenge worthy of the risks involved. The idea that would define the rest of Ernest's life came to him with crystalline clarity: the first crossing of the Antarctic continent. No explorer had ever attempted to traverse Antarctica from sea to sea, and the challenge would require everything Ernest had learned about polar travel, leadership, and survival. The route would cover nearly 1,800 miles, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea via the South Pole itself. It would be the last great journey of exploration left on Earth, a feat that would require not one but two ships, not one but two parties, and leadership of a quality that had never before been tested in polar conditions. Ernest threw himself into organizing what he grandly named the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The logistics were staggering. 2 ships, 56 men, supplies for 3 years, and equipment for a journey that would take the crossing party through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The financial requirements were enormous, and Ernest spent months charming wealthy donors, government officials, and newspaper publishers who might sponsor the expedition in exchange for exclusive coverage rights. It was during this fundraising campaign that Ernest placed his famous advertisement for crew members. The response was overwhelming. Over 5,000 applications for 28 positions. Ernest interviewed hundreds of candidates, looking not just for technical qualifications, but for the indefinable qualities that would allow men to endure months of isolation and hardship without breaking. He chose a mixture of experienced polar hands and younger men whose enthusiasm might compensate for their lack of experience. Frank Wild was Ernest's first selection, his second in command and the man he trusted above all others. Wild had served with Ernest on both previous Antarctic expeditions and had proved himself utterly reliable under the most difficult conditions. Short, wiry, and tough as ship's rope, Wild possessed the rare quality of being able to command respect without demanding it. Men followed him naturally, drawn by his competence and his absolute loyalty to Ernest. Frank Worsley was chosen as captain of the expedition ship, the Endurance. A New Zealand mariner with an almost mystical ability to navigate by dead reckoning, Worsley had applied for the position by walking into Ernest's office and announcing that he had dreamed the previous night of sailing through pack ice with Ernest Shackleton. Ernest, who believed in the power of intuition, hired him on the spot. Worsley would later prove that Ernest's instinct was correct. His navigational skills would mean the difference between life and death for the entire expedition. Tom Crean, the Irish giant who had served with both Scott and Ernest on previous expeditions, was selected for his legendary endurance and unshakable calm under pressure. Crean had once walked 35 miles alone across the Ross ice shelf to save the lives of 2 companions, and Ernest knew that such a man would be invaluable when the expedition faced its inevitable crises. Frank Hurley was chosen as expedition photographer, a role that proved crucial to preserving the expedition's story for posterity. Hurley was an artist as much as a technician, capable of capturing not just the physical reality of Antarctic conditions, but their emotional impact. His photographs would later provide the visual evidence that made the expedition's story believable to those who had never experienced such extremes. Harry McNish was selected as ship's carpenter despite, or perhaps because of, his reputation as a difficult, argumentative Scotsman. McNish's skill with wood and metal was legendary, and Ernest knew that the expedition's survival might depend on the carpenter's ability to repair equipment and modify gear under impossible conditions. That McNish was also stubborn, proud, and reluctant to accept authority was a risk Ernest accepted in exchange for his unparalleled competence. The remaining positions were filled with a mixture of scientists, sailors, and adventurers, each chosen for specific skills and qualities that Ernest believed would contribute to the expedition's success. The final crew included men from England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Australia, and Canada, a commonwealth in miniature bound together by their shared commitment to Ernest's vision. The ship that would carry them to Antarctica was the Endurance, a specially built vessel designed to withstand the pressure of pack ice. Constructed in Norwegian shipyards using techniques developed by Arctic whalers, The Endurance was 144 feet long, with a hull designed to ride up on ice rather than resist it, and a system of cross-bracing that distributed pressure throughout the entire structure. Her name came from Ernest's family motto, Fortitudine Vincimus, by endurance we conquer. As Ernest stood on the deck of the Endurance in London's East India Dock in the summer of 1914, watching his carefully selected crew make final preparations for departure, he could hardly have imagined the ordeal that awaited them. The ship was loaded with supplies for 3 years, tens of thousands of pounds of food, fuel for cooking and heating, scientific instruments, medical supplies, and equipment for the transcontinental journey. 69 Canadian sledge dogs occupied specially built kennels on deck, their howling a constant reminder of the wild places toward which the ship was heading. On August 1st, 1914, the Endurance slipped her moorings and headed down the Thames toward the open sea. That same day, Germany declared war on Russia, beginning the conflict that would engulf Europe and transform the world. Ernest received a telegram from the Admiralty asking whether he would turn his ship and men over to the war effort. His reply was immediate. The expedition was at the service of the country. But Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, responded with a single word: proceed. The world was plunging into its greatest war, but Ernest Shackleton was heading toward a different kind of battle, one that would test human endurance against the most implacable enemy on Earth, the Antarctic ice itself. As the Endurance steamed south through increasingly rough seas, her crew had no way of knowing that they were sailing towards circumstances that would make their planned transcontinental journey seem like a pleasant stroll compared to the struggle for mere survival that awaited them in the white wilderness ahead. The first weeks of the voyage south were deceptively pleasant. The Endurance cut through the South Atlantic swells with the easy grace of a ship built for rough seas, her engine driving her steadily toward Buenos Aires for final reprovisioning. The crew settled into the rhythms of shipboard life, watch duties, meal times, and the gradual process of 28 very different men learning to live together in the confined space of a polar vessel. Ernest moved among his men with the easy confidence of a commander who knew his business. He made it his practice to spend time with every member of the crew, learning their stories, understanding their motivations, and beginning the delicate process of welding them into the kind of unit that could survive months of isolation and hardship. Some came from naval backgrounds and were accustomed to rigid hierarchy. Others were civilian adventurers who had never lived under military discipline. Ernest's genius lay in creating a structure that incorporated both traditions, clear lines of authority when needed, but also the kind of informal camaraderie that would sustain morale through the dark Antarctic winter. Frank Wild proved invaluable in this process. Where Ernest inspired through vision and force of personality, Wild maintained discipline through quiet competence and absolute fairness. The men quickly learned that Wild's soft-spoken suggestions carried the weight of orders, and that his loyalty to Ernest was matched only by his concern for the welfare of every man aboard. Together, Ernest and Wild created an atmosphere of shared purpose that would prove crucial when the expedition faced its ultimate test. Captain Worsley navigated by instinct as much as by instrument, his weather-beaten face constantly scanning the horizon for signs of wind and weather. His uncanny ability to sense the ship's position seemed almost supernatural to the younger crew members, but Ernest recognized it as the mark of a master mariner, the kind of man who could find his way across trackless oceans using nothing but stars, currents, and the subtle signs that nature provided to those who knew how to read them. The photographer Frank Hurley was already at work, capturing images of the ship and crew that would later serve as precious reminders of how they all looked before the ice began its work upon them. Hurley's camera preserved moments of ordinary shipboard life that would soon seem impossibly distant. Men laughing at dinner, dogs playing on deck, the clean lines of a ship moving purposefully through blue water under a friendly sky. At Buenos Aires, Ernest received disturbing news about ice conditions in the Weddell Sea. Whalers returning from the south reported unusually heavy pack ice extending much farther north than normal. Old captains who had spent decades in Antarctic waters spoke of ice conditions they had never seen before, a solid barrier of frozen sea that showed no signs of breaking up despite the approach of the Antarctic summer. Ernest faced his first crucial decision of the expedition. He could delay departure until the ice conditions improved, but this would cost precious weeks of the short Antarctic summer. Alternatively, he could proceed as planned, trusting in the Endurance's ice-strengthened construction and his own experience in polar waters. The decision revealed something fundamental about Ernest's character. When confronted with uncertainty, his instinct was always to move forward rather than wait. On October 26, 1914, the Endurance departed Buenos Aires, heading south into waters that would soon test her strength and her crew's endurance in ways none of them could have imagined. The first icebergs appeared 3 days out of Buenos Aires, towering cathedrals of ice that dwarfed the ship and spoke of the vast frozen continent ahead. The crew lined the rails to stare at these mountain-sized chunks of Antarctic ice, many seeing their first bergs and awed by their terrible beauty. Ernest knew that these bergs were merely the outriders of the ice fields ahead, fragments broken from the great ice shelves and glaciers of Antarctica and carried north by currents and winds. As the Endurance pushed farther south, the icebergs grew more numerous, and the water temperature dropped steadily. Steam began rising from the sea in the early morning hours, and ice formed on the rigging overnight. The dogs, housed in their kennels on deck, began growing their thick winter coats, their wild instincts telling them that the territory ahead was unlike anything in their experience. On November 5th, the lookout spotted the first pack ice, a white line on the southern horizon that marked the beginning of the frozen ocean. Ernest climbed to the crow's nest to study the ice conditions with his binoculars, searching for the dark patches of open water that would indicate leads through the pack. What he saw was not encouraging. The ice extended as far as the horizon in every direction, a seemingly solid mass that showed few signs of the breaks and channels that would allow a ship to penetrate toward the Weddell Sea. But Ernest had not come this far to be turned back by ice conditions, however formidable. The Endurance had been built for exactly these circumstances, and Ernest had confidence in both his ship and his crew. He gave the order to enter the pack, beginning a journey through the ice that would ultimately trap them for 20 months and test their endurance beyond all human limits. The first days in the pack ice were almost pleasant, a kind of frozen playground where the ship could thread her way between ice floes the size of city blocks. Captain Worsley proved his skill at ice navigation, reading the subtle signs that indicated where the floes were loose and where they were jammed tight. The engine pushed the Endurance through narrow leads of open water, while her reinforced bow crushed through ice barriers that were too thin to stop her progress. The crew was fascinated by this new world of ice and snow. The pack was alive with wildlife, seals basking on floes, whales surfacing in the leads, and penguins that approached the ship with the fearless curiosity of creatures that had never learned to fear humans. Frank Hurley was in his element, photographing everything from the ship's struggle through the ice to the expressions of wonder on the crew's faces as they encountered the Antarctic for the first time. But as the days passed, the ice conditions grew progressively worse. The leads became narrower and more difficult to navigate, forcing the ship to take increasingly circuitous routes toward their destination. Sometimes they would spend an entire day traveling only a few miles, the ship backing and ramming through ice barriers that seemed to reform as quickly as they were broken. The sound of ice grinding against the ship's hull became a constant background noise, a reminder that they were moving through a landscape that could crush their vessel if they made a single mistake. Ernest maintained an outward appearance of confidence, but privately he was growing concerned about their slow progress. Each day spent struggling through the pack was a day lost from their precious Antarctic summer, and he knew that once winter set in, the ice would become impenetrable until the following spring. The transcontinental journey required that they reach the Weddell Sea coast while conditions still allowed for landing and the establishment of their base camp. On December 5th, exactly a month after entering the pack ice, the lookout spotted something that made every man on deck cheer, a dark line on the southern horizon that could only be land. They had reached the Antarctic continent. the edge of the great ice sheet that covered the bottom of the world. Ernest felt a surge of relief and excitement as he studied the distant mountains through his binoculars. They had overcome the pack ice and reached their destination. The transcontinental journey could begin. But their celebration was premature. As the Endurance pushed closer to the coast, it became clear that a continuous barrier of ice extended from the shore to the horizon, with no visible break that would allow them to land. The Weddell Sea, which they had expected to find partially open, was completely frozen, a solid sheet of ice that showed no signs of breaking up despite the advanced Antarctic summer. Ernest faced a decision that would determine the fate of the entire expedition. He could retreat from the Weddell Sea and attempt to land somewhere along the coast where ice conditions might be more favorable. This would mean abandoning the carefully planned transcontinental route and improvising a new objective for the expedition. Alternatively, he could wait in the pack ice for conditions to improve, gambling that the Weddell Sea ice would eventually break up and allow them to reach their intended landing site. True to his nature, Ernest chose to wait and fight rather than retreat and compromise. He ordered the ship to find a position in the pack ice where they could ride out the delay, confident that the strong summer sun would soon break up the sea ice and open their route to the coast. It was a decision born of optimism and determination, but it would prove to be the choice that sealed their fate. The Endurance found what seemed like a secure position in a large pool of open water surrounded by relatively loose pack ice. Here they could wait for the ice conditions to improve while maintaining the ship in readiness for a quick dash to the coast when the opportunity arose. Ernest established a routine of regular ice reconnaissance, sending men out on skis to study the condition of the surrounding floes and watch for signs of movement that might indicate the pack was beginning to break up. December passed with agonizing slowness. The ship remained trapped in her pool of open water, surrounded by ice that showed no signs of opening despite the 24-hour daylight of Antarctic summer. The crew maintained their spirits through a combination of work, entertainment, and Ernest's unwavering confidence that their situation would soon improve. They held regular concerts featuring the expedition's banjo and accordion players, organized football matches on nearby ice floes, and maintained the ship in perfect condition for the dash to shore that surely lay just ahead. But the ice had other plans. Instead of breaking up as Ernest had expected, the pack was being compressed by powerful winds and currents, forcing the floes together with irresistible pressure. The open water around the Endurance began to shrink as the ice closed in from all sides. By January 1915, it became clear that they were no longer waiting for the ice to open. They were trapped in it. Their ship held fast in a frozen prison that showed no signs of releasing them. Ernest's journal entries from this period revealed the strain he was under, though he maintained his outward composure. "The ice conditions are more severe than any I have previously encountered," he wrote, "but I have complete confidence in the ship and the men. We shall either reach our destination or create a new one from whatever circumstances we find ourselves facing." The reality of their situation became undeniable when the Antarctic summer ended in February, and the pack ice began to thicken with the approaching winter. The Endurance was no longer a ship waiting to continue her voyage. She was now a floating prison, carried helplessly by the slow drift of the pack ice wherever the currents and winds chose to take her. Ernest gathered his men and explained their new circumstances with characteristic directness. "Ship and stores have become a winter station," he told them. "We are no longer an expedition sailing toward adventure. We are castaways, and our survival depends entirely on our ability to work together and maintain our discipline through the months ahead." The transformation from active expedition to survival camp required a complete reorganization of their lives aboard the Endurance. The transcontinental journey was postponed indefinitely, perhaps forever. Now their only objective was to keep 28 men alive and healthy through an Antarctic winter while trapped in a ship that was entirely at the mercy of forces beyond human control. Ernest established new routines designed to maintain both physical health and mental morale through the long polar night that was approaching. Work details were organized to keep the ship in perfect condition even though she was going nowhere. Exercise periods were mandatory. with men taking turns on stationary bicycles and organized games on the ice around the ship. Educational programs were established, with crew members teaching each other everything from navigation to poetry. Most crucially, Ernest established what he called the democratic mess, a system where officers and crew members ate together and shared equally in all the work and hardships of their situation. This broke down the traditional naval hierarchy that had governed the ship during the sailing phase of the expedition and created a more egalitarian community better suited to their new circumstances. It was a radical departure from maritime tradition, but Ernest understood that survival would require every man to give his best effort, and that such effort could not be commanded. It had to be freely given. The dogs proved to be both a blessing and a challenge during this period. They provided companionship and entertainment for the men, but they also required feeding from the expedition's carefully rationed stores. Each man adopted particular dogs as pets, creating relationships that would later become sources of both comfort and heartbreak as the expedition's circumstances grew more desperate. As the Antarctic winter closed in around them, the sun disappeared below the horizon for the last time until spring, leaving the Endurance in the perpetual darkness of polar night. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the wind created conditions that made any time spent outside the ship an ordeal of numbing cold and disorientation. The pack ice around them continued to move and shift, carrying the ship slowly northward at the rate of perhaps a mile per day, a pace so slow as to be almost imperceptible, but significant enough to take them farther from their intended destination with each passing week. Ernest maintained his evening walks around the ship regardless of weather conditions, a visible reminder to his men that their leader remained confident and in control despite their desperate circumstances. His footsteps in the snow became a source of comfort to men lying in their bunks, proof that Ernest Shackleton was still on watch, still thinking, still planning their eventual escape from the ice. But privately, Ernest was beginning to understand the magnitude of the challenge they faced. The Endurance was trapped in ice that extended for hundreds of miles in every direction, carried by currents that were taking them away from any known land. Their supplies, carefully calculated for a transcontinental expedition, were now their only barrier against starvation in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. And winter had only just begun. The pressure on the ship began in earnest during the depths of winter. The ice surrounding the Endurance was not static. It was in constant motion, driven by winds and currents that created enormous forces throughout the pack. Sometimes the ice would relax its grip slightly, allowing the ship to settle more comfortably in her frozen dock. But increasingly, the floes began to press against the ship's hull with pressure that made her timbers groan and her steel fittings scream in protest. Harry McNish, the ship's carpenter, became one of the most important men aboard as he monitored every sound the ship made and reinforced areas where the pressure was concentrating. His decades of experience with wooden ships allowed him to interpret the creaks and groans that echoed through the hull, distinguishing between the normal sounds of a ship under stress and the warning signs that indicated genuine danger. The crew learned to sleep through the ordinary sounds of ice pressure, but they would all wake instantly when the ship made the particular noise that indicated she was being squeezed beyond her design limits. These moments became part of the rhythm of their trapped existence, periods of relative quiet, interrupted by episodes of terror as the ice demonstrated its power to crush their vessel like an eggshell. Ernest's leadership during these crises was masterful. He never showed fear, never suggested that their situation was hopeless, and always had a plan ready to implement if the ship was damaged beyond repair. He organized regular drills for abandoning ship, ensuring that every man knew exactly what supplies to grab and where to go if the Endurance was finally crushed by the ice. These preparations were conducted with the same matter-of-fact efficiency that characterized all of Ernest's leadership, creating confidence rather than panic among the crew. Spring arrived in September, bringing sunlight back to their frozen world, but no relief from the ice that held them prisoner. If anything, the returning warmth made their situation more dangerous as the ice began to move more actively, creating pressure ridges and leads that demonstrated the enormous forces at work throughout the pack. The ship was no longer simply frozen in place. She was being carried along by ice floes that were themselves in constant collision with other floes, creating a landscape of frozen chaos that could crush anything caught between the moving masses. It was during this period that Ernest made one of his most crucial decisions. Rather than continuing to hope for the ship's release from the ice, he began serious preparations for abandoning the Endurance and attempting to reach safety over the frozen surface of the Weddell Sea. It was a decision born of realism rather than despair. Ernest could see that the ice pressure was increasing rather than decreasing, and he knew that the ship's destruction was now a matter of when, not if. The preparations for abandoning ship required careful calculation of what could be carried and what would have to be left behind. Every item had to be evaluated not just for its utility but for its weight. Men traveling over rough ice could carry only the most essential supplies, and every unnecessary pound would reduce their chances of survival. Ernest made the heartbreaking decision to leave behind most of their scientific instruments and all but the most precious personal possessions. The transcontinental journey was now completely abandoned in favor of the simpler but more desperate goal of reaching safety. The end came suddenly, as Ernest had always known it would. On October 27, 1915, the ice pressure reached a level that the Endurance could no longer withstand. The ship's hull began to buckle under the enormous forces pressing against her, and water started pouring through cracks in her planking that no amount of carpentry could repair. Ernest gave the order that every polar explorer dreaded but always prepared for: abandon ship. The crew had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but the reality was still shocking. In a matter of hours, they transformed from sailors aboard a secure vessel to castaways on the polar ice, with nothing but what they could carry and their faith in Ernest Shackleton's ability to bring them home alive. The ship that had been their world for over a year was dying beneath their feet, her hull crushed, and her masts tilting at impossible angles as the ice completed its work of destruction. Frank Hurley managed to save some of his precious photographic plates, capturing the final moments of the Endurance as she was slowly consumed by the ice that had held her prisoner. His images preserve forever the terrible beauty of the ship's death, her elegant lines distorted by pressure, her rigging tangled and broken, her hull split open like a broken toy discarded by a careless giant. Ernest watched his ship die with the stoicism of a commander who had always known this moment might come, but also with the grief of a man who understood that 28 lives now depended entirely on his ability to lead them across hundreds of miles of broken ice toward a safety that might not exist. The Endurance was gone, crushed and swallowed by the Antarctic ice, but Ernest Shackleton and his 27 companions were still alive, still together, and still under the command of a leader who had never lost a man under his care. Their real journey was just beginning. The sight of 28 men standing on an ice floe beside their dying ship would have been comic under other circumstances. Grown men with their most precious possessions clutched in their arms, looking like refugees from some impossible disaster. But there was nothing comic about their situation. They were now inhabitants of one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with no shelter except their tents, no transportation except their own feet, and no hope of rescue except what they could create through their own efforts. Ernest's first decision as leader of the castaways revealed the pragmatic genius that would keep them all alive. Rather than immediately attempting the march toward land, he ordered the establishment of what he called Patience Camp on a large, stable ice floe near the wreck of the Endurance. His reasoning was coldly logical. The men were not yet physically or psychologically prepared for the grueling journey across the broken ice, and their chances of survival would be better if they remained in one place while the pack ice drifted northward toward the edge of the Weddell Sea. The establishment of Patience Camp required a complete reimagining of how 28 men could live on a piece of floating ice with no resources except what they had salvaged from their ship. Tents were erected in a rough circle, with a larger tent serving as a communal dining hall and meeting place. The precious stores of food were carefully inventoried and rationed with mathematical precision. Each man would receive exactly what was needed to maintain health and strength, with no allowance for the comfort of a full meal or the luxury of personal preference. Frank Wild proved invaluable in organizing the practical aspects of their new existence. His experience with polar camping and his natural ability to maintain discipline without creating resentment made him the perfect second-in-command for their desperate circumstances. While Ernest maintained overall leadership and morale, Wild handled the daily details that kept them functioning as a unit: work assignments, meal preparation, and the thousand small decisions that determined whether they would survive each day or begin the slow slide toward disaster. The psychological challenge of their situation was as dangerous as the physical hardships. 28 men, accustomed to the purposeful routine of an expedition, now found themselves with nothing to do but wait while their fate was decided by forces entirely beyond their control. The pack ice would carry them where it chose to carry them. The weather would do to them what weather chose to do. Their only agency lay in how they responded to circumstances that they could not influence or escape. Ernest understood that idle men would quickly become desperate men, and desperate men would become dangerous to themselves and their companions. He established a routine of camp duties that kept everyone occupied: ice watches to guard against floe movements that might endanger the camp, hunting parties to supplement their rations with seals and penguins, and maintenance work on their equipment and shelters. But most importantly, he created what he privately called morale duties, activities designed not for their practical value but for their ability to maintain the crew's sense of dignity and purpose. The evening gatherings in the communal tent became the cornerstone of their psychological survival. Here, by the light of a blubber lamp, the men would share stories, sing songs, and participate in debates about everything from literature to politics to the proper way to prepare penguin steaks. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They kept the men's minds active, maintained social bonds that prevented the isolation that could lead to breakdown, and provided Ernest with a daily opportunity to assess each man's mental state and intervene before problems became crises. Dr. Alexander Macklin, the expedition's physician, found himself treating ailments that no medical school had prepared him to handle. Physical injuries from the brutal work of ice travel were common enough: frostbitten fingers, wrenched backs, cuts from sharp ice. But increasingly, he was dealing with what he privately termed ice madness, the psychological effects of prolonged isolation, uncertainty, and fear on men pushed beyond their normal limits of endurance. Some men became obsessively talkative, desperate to fill every moment of silence with words. Others withdrew into themselves, speaking only when directly addressed and spending hours staring at the ice with expressions that worried their companions. A few developed what Macklin recognized as the polar equivalent of combat fatigue: sudden starts at unexpected sounds, inability to sleep despite exhaustion, and a haunted look that spoke of minds struggling to process experiences beyond normal human reference. Ernest's response to these psychological casualties was characteristically direct and effective. He made it his business to spend individual time with every man who showed signs of strain, drawing them out through conversation, involving them in planning discussions, and finding ways to make them feel essential to the group's survival. His instinct for understanding what each man needed, whether it was responsibility, recognition, or simple human companionship, was remarkable, even by the standards of his proven leadership abilities. The dogs presented both a blessing and a crisis as the weeks stretched into months. They provided emotional companionship that helped maintain morale, and their presence created a sense of normality that was psychologically crucial. Men who might have broken under the strain of their situation found strength in caring for animals that depended on them. The daily routine of feeding, exercising, and grooming the dogs gave structure to days that might otherwise have dissolved into listless despair. But the dogs were also consuming precious food supplies at a rate that threatened the men's long-term survival. Each dog required approximately 2 pounds of food per day, food that came from the same limited stores that had to sustain the men through an ordeal of unknown duration. Ernest faced one of the most agonizing decisions of his leadership career. The dogs would have to be systematically destroyed to conserve food for the men. The task was assigned to Frank Wild, whose steady nerves and practical nature made him the best choice for this heartbreaking duty. But the psychological impact on the entire crew was devastating. These were not simply working animals, they were companions who had shared the men's isolation and hardship, individual personalities that had become part of the expedition's family. Each death was mourned as a genuine loss, and the accumulating grief became another burden that the survivors had to carry along with their physical hardships. Ernest's own grief at the loss of the dogs was evident to anyone who knew him well, but he never allowed personal emotion to interfere with the decisions required for survival. "We cannot save the dogs and ourselves," he wrote in his journal. "The choice is arithmetic, not sentiment. But each death diminishes us, and I pray that we shall not have to make many more such choices before this ordeal ends." As the Antarctic summer of 1915 to 1916 progressed, it became clear that the pack ice was not carrying them toward the open ocean as quickly as Ernest had hoped. Their northward drift was measurable but agonizingly slow, sometimes as little as a few hundred yards per day, occasionally as much as several miles when wind and current aligned favorably. At this rate, they might reach the edge of the pack ice sometime during the following year, but only if their ice flow remained stable and their supplies lasted long enough to sustain them through the journey. The stability of their ice flow became a constant source of anxiety. The piece of frozen ocean that supported Patience Camp was perhaps half a mile across at its widest point, large enough to provide temporary safety, but small enough that a single crack could split their camp in half or dump them all into the freezing water of the Weddell Sea. Ernest established a regular watch system to monitor the flow for signs of weakness, and the men became expert at reading the subtle sounds that indicated when their floating island was under stress. Several times during their months at Patience Camp, they were awakened by the terrible sound of ice breaking under enormous pressure. Men would stumble from their tents to find that cracks had appeared overnight, sometimes passing within yards of their shelters. On one terrifying occasion, a crack opened directly through the center of the camp, forcing them to hastily relocate their tents and supplies to avoid being separated from each other on two different pieces of ice. These crises reinforced Ernest's decision to remain in one place rather than attempting to march across the unstable pack ice toward land. If their own carefully chosen flow could crack without warning, the chances of safely crossing hundreds of miles of broken, shifting ice were virtually non-existent. Their survival depended on patience, discipline, and the hope that the natural drift of the pack ice would eventually carry them to safety. The food situation required constant management and increasingly difficult decisions. Ernest and Wild calculated their supplies with the precision of accountants, balancing calories against time, protein against morale, and survival against comfort. Meals became ceremonies of exact division, with each man receiving his precise portion and no more. Waste of any kind became not just discouraged, but unthinkable. Every scrap of food represented precious time added to their survival. Hunting provided some supplement to their dwindling stores, but the results were unpredictable. Seals were relatively common on the ice floes around their camp, but they were wary animals that required skill and luck to approach close enough for a successful shot. When a seal was killed, nothing was wasted. The meat provided protein, the blubber served as fuel for their lamps and stoves, and even the hide was used for equipment repairs and weatherproofing. Penguin hunting was more reliable, but required expeditions away from the camp that carried their own risks. The nearest penguin colonies were sometimes miles away across unstable ice, and the hunting parties faced the constant danger of being cut off from the main camp by opening leads or sudden weather changes. But penguin meat, while strong-tasting and tough, provided essential nutrition that their preserved foods could not supply. The psychological effect of hunting on the men was complex and sometimes disturbing. These were not professional hunters, but sailors, scientists, and adventurers who now found themselves killing animals for survival. Some adapted quickly to this necessity, developing the hunter's mentality that allowed them to take life efficiently and without excessive emotion. Others struggled with the moral implications of their situation, particularly when they had to kill seals or penguins that showed no fear of humans and seemed to regard the men with curious friendliness. Ernest himself participated in the hunting when necessary, but he delegated most of this work to men who showed both aptitude and psychological resilience for the task. He understood that every aspect of their survival routine was also a test of each man's ability to adapt to circumstances that pushed against the boundaries of normal human experience. Those who could adapt would be more likely to survive. Those who could not might become liabilities that endangered the entire group. The changing of seasons brought new challenges and a growing sense of urgency to their situation. As autumn approached, the temperature began dropping steadily, and the pack ice around them started to thicken and solidify. This reduced the danger of their floe breaking up suddenly, but it also meant that their northward drift would slow even further during the winter months ahead. More significantly, the approaching winter meant that their window of opportunity for any active escape attempt was rapidly closing. If they were going to abandon their ice floe and attempt to reach land before winter made such travel impossible, the decision would have to be made soon. But Ernest's reconnaissance expeditions across the surrounding ice revealed conditions that made such an attempt virtually suicidal. Pressure ridges of broken ice that would be impossible to cross with sledges, open leads of water that appeared and disappeared without warning, and rough, unstable ice that would exhaust the men within days of leaving their camp. The decision to remain at Patience Camp through another Antarctic winter was one of the most difficult of Ernest's career. Every instinct told him to act, to move, to attempt something active rather than simply waiting for salvation that might never come. But his experience and judgment told him that premature action would likely kill them all, while patience at least offered the possibility of survival until circumstances improved. The psychological impact of this decision on the crew was severe. Men who had maintained their spirits through months of waiting began to show signs of deeper despair when they realized that their ordeal would continue through another polar winter. The brief Antarctic summer had offered hope that their situation might somehow resolve itself quickly. The approach of winter brought the crushing realization that they might spend another full year trapped on the ice, consuming their limited supplies while waiting for rescue or death. Ernest responded to this crisis of morale with one of his most inspired leadership decisions. Rather than simply announcing that they would remain at Patience Camp through the winter, he called a formal meeting of the entire crew and presented the decision as a collective choice. He laid out their options honestly: the dangers of attempting to march across the ice, the risks of remaining where they were, and the calculations that suggested their best chance of survival lay in continuing their patient drift toward the edge of the pack. The discussion that followed was remarkable for its maturity and mutual respect. Men voiced their fears, their frustrations, and their desperate desire to take some kind of action, however dangerous. But they also acknowledged the logic of Ernest's analysis and the expertise that had kept them alive through their months of captivity. When the vote was finally taken, it was unanimous. They would remain together at Patience Camp and continue to drift north with the ice. This democratic process served multiple psychological purposes that Ernest understood intuitively. By making the crew participants in the decision rather than simply recipients of orders, he maintained their sense of agency and responsibility for their own survival. Men who might have despaired at being passive victims of circumstances could find strength in the knowledge that they were active partners in a survival strategy, even when that strategy required them to do nothing but wait. The second Antarctic winter brought challenges that tested the limits of their physical and psychological endurance. The temperature dropped to levels that made any activity outside their shelters an ordeal of numbing cold and disorientation. The perpetual darkness of polar night returned, trapping them in a world illuminated only by the flickering light of their blubber lamps and the occasional miracle of the aurora australis painting the sky in colors that seemed impossible in such a desolate place. Their supplies were now critically low, rationed to the minimum levels that could sustain life but no longer provide any buffer against miscalculation or emergency. Each meal became a reminder of how precarious their situation had become, and each day that passed without some sign of improvement brought them closer to the point where survival would become mathematically impossible. But Ernest's leadership during this darkest period of their ordeal was perhaps his finest achievement. He maintained not just order but morale among men who had every reason to despair. His evening talks in the communal tent became lifelines for minds struggling with isolation and fear. His daily walks around the camp perimeter continued regardless of weather, visible proof that their leader remained confident and vigilant. His personal attention to each man's physical and emotional state prevented the individual breakdowns that could have destroyed the group's cohesion. Most remarkably, Ernest began planning for their eventual escape from the ice even as their situation grew more desperate. He studied maps and charts salvaged from the ship, calculating distances and routes to various landing points. He organized the remaining equipment into loads that could be carried by sledge teams when the time came to abandon Patience Camp. He even conducted training exercises, preparing the men for the physical demands of ice travel despite their weakened condition and limited food supplies. These preparations served the crucial psychological function of maintaining hope when despair would have been the rational response to their circumstances. Men who might have given up entirely found strength in the knowledge that their leader still believed in their eventual survival and was actively planning for their escape. The activities gave purpose to their daily routine and maintained the discipline that would be essential if they ever did get the chance to make their break for freedom. The break, when it finally came, arrived not as a gradual improvement in their situation, but as a sudden crisis that transformed their patient waiting into desperate action. In April 1916, after more than 5 months at Patience Camp, their ice floe began showing signs of serious instability. Cracks appeared overnight, widened during the day, and began threatening the integrity of their floating island. The final crisis came with shocking suddenness. On April 9th, a major crack opened directly through the center of their camp, passing between the tents and forcing them to hastily relocate their supplies to avoid being separated. But instead of stabilizing, the crack continued to widen, and by evening it was clear that their ice floe was breaking apart under the stress of pressure and current. Ernest gave the order that transformed them from patient castaways into active survivors. They would abandon Patience Camp immediately and attempt to reach land by marching across the pack ice, dragging their boats and essential supplies on sledges. It was the decision he had been preparing for during all the months of waiting, but it still represented a leap into the unknown that could easily result in the death of every man under his command. The evacuation of Patience Camp was conducted with the disciplined efficiency that months of preparation had made possible. Each man knew exactly what supplies he was responsible for, which route to take, and where to assemble for the march. The 3 boats salvaged from the Endurance, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, were loaded onto sledges along with the most essential food, clothing, and equipment. Everything else was abandoned on the breaking ice floe that had been their home for 5 months. Frank Hurley made one final trip back to the abandoned camp to retrieve some of his precious photographic plates, images that would later provide the only visual record of their extraordinary ordeal. His dedication to preserving their story, even at the risk of his own life, reflected the sense of historical significance that Ernest had instilled in all of them. The understanding that they were not just trying to survive, but to bear witness to human endurance under the most extreme conditions imaginable. As they began their march across the broken pack ice, pulling sledges loaded with boats and supplies, Ernest looked back once at the camp that had sustained them through their darkest months. The tents were already being claimed by the wind, and the ice floe was visibly breaking apart, chunks of their former home drifting away on currents that would carry them into the vast emptiness of the Weddell Sea. Behind them lay 5 months of waiting, hoping, and enduring. And ahead lay the unknown challenges of crossing the most dangerous ice field on Earth with 3 small boats and whatever strength remained in 28 men who had already been tested far beyond normal human limits. Ernest had no illusions about the difficulty of what lay ahead, but he also had no doubt about the quality of the men who would face it with him. The march towards salvation was about to begin. The march across the pack ice began with the brutal education that separated theory from reality. Ernest had studied the maps, calculated the distances, and prepared his men for the physical demands of ice travel. But no amount of planning could have prepared them for the savage complexity of the polar surface they now had to cross. The pack ice was not the smooth, white highway that inexperienced imagination might envision. It was a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges 30 feet high, crevasses that could swallow a man without trace, and blocks of ice the size of houses scattered like the debris of some titanic battle. Between these obstacles lay stretches of newer ice, sometimes smooth enough for easy travel, but often covered with a layer of snow that concealed deadly holes and weak spots that would give way under the weight of a sledge or the footstep of an unwary man. The boats proved to be both salvation and curse. The James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills represented their only hope of reaching safety once they gained open water, but dragging them across the broken ice required a physical effort that pushed the weakened men to the edge of collapse. Each boat weighed over 1,000 pounds when loaded with essential supplies, and moving them over the pressure ridges required all 28 men working together with ropes and leverage, sometimes taking hours to advance a few hundred yards. Frank Worsley's navigational skills became crucial in ways he had never anticipated. The pack ice offered no landmarks, no fixed points of reference that could guide them toward their destination. Everything was in constant motion. The ice floes beneath their feet, the pressure ridges that blocked their path, even the horizon itself shifting as their floating world drifted with currents and winds. Worsley navigated by dead reckoning and sun sights when possible, but increasingly he relied on intuition and experience to choose the routes that might lead them toward open water. The physical toll of the march was immediately apparent. Men who had maintained reasonable health during their months at Patience Camp began showing signs of serious deterioration within days of beginning the journey. The constant strain of pulling heavy sledges over rough ice, combined with reduced rations and the stress of sleeping on the open ice, created a downward spiral of exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm them before they could reach safety. Dr. Macklin found himself treating injuries that would have been minor inconveniences under normal circumstances, but became serious threats to survival in their current situation. Pulled muscles that prevented a man from doing his share of the hauling work, cuts and abrasions that refused to heal in the extreme cold, frostbite that claimed fingers and toes, reducing each victim's ability to contribute to the group's survival while increasing his dependence on his companion's care. But the psychological challenge proved even more dangerous than the physical hardships. During their months at Patience Camp, the men had adapted to a routine of patient waiting, sustained by the hope that their situation would eventually improve through forces beyond their control. Now they were required to take active responsibility for their own survival, making life and death decisions every hour while their strength ebbed and their margin for error disappeared. Some men rose to meet this challenge with remarkable resilience. Tom Crean proved himself capable of superhuman effort, pulling his sledge load through conditions that left other men gasping and struggling. Frank Wild maintained the discipline and organization that kept them functioning as a unit, even when individual members began showing signs of breakdown. Captain Worsley's steady navigation and unshakable optimism provided crucial psychological support during the moments when the march seemed hopeless. But others began to crack under the unprecedented strain. Harry McNish, the carpenter whose skills had been invaluable aboard the Endurance, became increasingly difficult and argumentative, questioning Ernest's decisions and undermining the discipline that their survival required. The older man's pride rebelled against taking orders from someone he regarded as his social inferior, and his complaints began affecting the morale of other crew members who were struggling with their own doubts and fears. Ernest's response to this crisis of authority was swift and decisive. Rather than allowing the situation to deteriorate through argument and debate, he called McNish aside for a private conversation that left no doubt about who commanded the expedition. The exact words of their exchange were never recorded, but witnesses reported that McNish emerged from the encounter with a new understanding of the consequences of insubordination under survival conditions. Ernest had made it clear that he would tolerate no behavior that endangered the group's cohesion, and that men who could not accept his authority were welcome to try surviving on their own. The incident with McNish served notice to the entire crew that their democratic discussions and collaborative decision-making belonged to their past circumstances at Patience Camp. Now they were in a situation where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death, and such decisions could only be made by a single leader whose authority was absolute and unquestioned. Ernest had transformed himself from expedition commander to survival dictator, a role he accepted reluctantly but exercised with the firmness that their desperate situation required. Progress across the ice was agonizingly slow and unpredictable. On good days, when the ice was relatively smooth and the weather favorable, they might cover 2 or 3 miles. On bad days, they would struggle for hours to advance a few hundred yards, or find their path blocked by pressure ridges that forced them to backtrack and seek alternate routes. Worst of all were the days when they discovered that the ice floe beneath them had drifted backward during the night, canceling out their previous day's progress and leaving them farther from their destination than when they had begun. The randomness of their progress created a psychological torture that tested even Ernest's legendary optimism. Men could accept hardship and suffering when it led toward a clear goal, but the possibility that their efforts were meaningless, that they might be walking in circles while their supplies dwindled and their strength failed, threatened to break the spirit of even the most determined survivors. Ernest responded to this crisis by changing their objective. Rather than attempting to reach the distant Antarctic peninsula, he announced that they would head for Paulet Island, where they knew an emergency supply depot had been established by a previous expedition. Paulet Island was closer than their original destination, but more importantly, it represented a concrete goal that the men could visualize and believe in. The psychological effect of having a specific target, however difficult to reach, proved more valuable than the actual reduction in distance. Food became an obsession that dominated every conversation and filled every spare moment with calculation and speculation. Their supplies were now rationed to starvation levels, barely enough to sustain life, with no margin for increased activity or unexpected delays. Each meal became a ceremony of exact measurement and division, with hungry men watching every movement of the cook to ensure that no one received even a morsel more than his fair share. The hunting that had supplemented their diet at Patience Camp was now virtually impossible during the march. The constant movement and the need to maintain progress toward their destination left little time or energy for the careful stalking that seal hunting required. Occasionally they would encounter penguins or seals on the ice floes they crossed, but the noise and commotion of 28 men with sledges and boats usually frightened the animals away before any hunting attempt could be organized. Sleep became another form of torture under their new circumstances. The tents that had provided adequate shelter at Patience Camp were barely sufficient protection for men camping on the open ice while constantly on the move. The sleeping bags that had seemed comfortable during their static existence now felt thin and inadequate against the bitter cold that penetrated everything they owned. Men would lie awake shivering, too cold to sleep but too exhausted to generate the body heat that might warm their inadequate bedding. But worst of all was the knowledge that sleep itself had become dangerous. The ice beneath them was in constant motion, and floes that seemed stable when they made camp could crack or break apart during the night, dumping sleeping men into the deadly water of the Weddell Sea. Ernest established a watch system to guard against this danger, but the psychological stress of never being able to rest completely made sleep fitful and unrefreshing even when exhaustion finally overcame anxiety. After 6 days of struggling across the pack ice, they had covered less than 10 miles, a rate of progress that made their goal mathematically impossible to achieve before their food supplies ran out. Ernest faced the most crucial decision of the entire expedition, whether to continue the march toward Paulet Island or to find a stable ice floe where they could wait for the pack ice to carry them closer to open water. The decision was complicated by the deteriorating condition of his men. Several were showing signs of serious exhaustion that made continued marching dangerous. Others were developing the symptoms of scurvy that indicated their limited diet was no longer providing adequate nutrition. Most seriously, the group's unity was beginning to fracture under the stress, with individual men starting to think more about personal survival than collective success. Ernest called a halt on what appeared to be a relatively stable ice floe and announced that they would establish a new camp while he considered their options. But privately, he had already made his decision. The march across the pack ice had failed, and their survival now depended on returning to the patient strategy that had sustained them at Patience Camp. They would drift with the ice and hope that currents would carry them to a position where they could launch the boats into open water. The establishment of what Ernest privately called dump camp required a brutal winnowing of their remaining supplies. They could no longer carry the weight that had already proven too much for their weakened condition, and every item had to be evaluated for its absolute necessity to survival. Personal possessions that had survived the abandonment of the ship and the evacuation of Patience Camp were now discarded without sentiment. Scientific instruments, expedition records, and equipment that might have been valuable under other circumstances were left on the ice to make room for the food and shelter materials that represented their only hope of staying alive until rescue became possible. Frank Hurley faced the most heartbreaking decision of any expedition member when Ernest ordered him to reduce his collection of photographic plates to the bare minimum that could be justified under their survival circumstances. Hurley had already sacrificed most of his work when they abandoned ship, then abandoned more when they left Patience Camp. Now he was required to leave behind additional irreplaceable images that documented their extraordinary ordeal. The plates he selected for preservation were chosen not for their artistic value but for their potential historical importance, images that might tell the story of the expedition if they survived to share it with the world. The photographers' dedication to preserving their story, even at the cost of images that represented months of dangerous work, reflected the sense of historical mission that Ernest had instilled in all of them. They were not just trying to survive, they were trying to bear witness to human endurance under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The photographs that Hurley saved would later provide crucial evidence that their story was not exaggerated or embellished, but a factual account of men pushed beyond the normal limits of human experience. Dump camp proved to be even more psychologically challenging than their march across the ice. During the march, the men had been sustained by the sense that they were actively working toward their survival, that their suffering had purpose and direction. Now they were back to passive waiting, watching their food supplies dwindle while hoping that forces beyond their control would somehow carry them to safety. The ice floe that supported Dump Camp was smaller and less stable than their previous refuge at Patience Camp, adding the constant anxiety of potential disaster to their existing hardships. Cracks would appear overnight, sometimes passing close enough to their tents to wake men with the terrifying sound of ice breaking under pressure. The floe would shift and tilt without warning, forcing them to relocate their camp at a moment's notice to avoid being dumped into the sea. But the most dangerous threat to their survival was no longer physical, it was psychological. Men who had maintained their spirits through months of hardship were beginning to show signs of the despair that could prove more deadly than cold or hunger. The failure of their march across the ice had shattered the illusion that they could control their fate through effort and determination. Now they were forced to confront the possibility that they might simply drift until their food ran out, and they died of starvation on a piece of floating ice in the middle of the Weddell Sea. Ernest's response to this crisis of morale was one of his most masterful demonstrations of leadership under impossible circumstances. Rather than attempting to maintain false optimism or minimize the seriousness of their situation, he acknowledged their desperate circumstances honestly while focusing their attention on the actions that were still within their control. They could not determine where the ice would carry them, but they could maintain their equipment, preserve their health, and stay ready to take advantage of any opportunity that circumstances might offer. The daily routine at Dump Camp was designed around these achievable objectives. Men were assigned to maintain the boats in perfect condition for immediate launching if open water appeared. Others were responsible for monitoring their supplies and ensuring that every scrap of food was preserved and protected. Hunting parties were organized whenever seals or penguins were spotted, with the understanding that any supplementary food could extend their survival time and improve their chances of eventual rescue. Most importantly, Ernest established what he called readiness drills. regular practice sessions where the crew rehearsed launching the boats and loading them with essential supplies. These drills served multiple purposes. They kept the men's skills sharp, maintained their physical condition through exercise, and provided psychological preparation for the moment when they would have to abandon the ice and trust their lives to small boats in the treacherous waters of the Southern Ocean. The drills also reinforced the chain of command and the specific responsibilities of each crew member during the critical transition from ice camp to boat journey. Frank Worsley would command the James Caird, the largest and most seaworthy of their 3 boats. Tom Crean would captain the Dudley Docker, while Ernest himself would take command of the Stancomb Wills. Each man knew exactly which boat he was assigned to, what supplies he was responsible for carrying, and what position he would take once they were afloat. This preparation proved crucial when their moment of opportunity finally arrived. On April 9, 1916, exactly 5 months after the Endurance had been crushed by the ice, a lookout spotted something that made every man in the camp forget his exhaustion and despair. A dark line on the northern horizon that could only mean open water. The edge of the pack ice was still miles away, but for the first time since their ordeal began, they could see their path to salvation. The ice between their floe and the open water was broken and dangerous, but it was no longer the impenetrable barrier that had trapped them for so many months. If they could successfully navigate their boats through the loose pack ice, they would reach the open ocean where Ernest's seamanship and Worsley's navigation could give them a fighting chance of reaching land. But even as opportunity appeared, their situation became more precarious. The ice floe supporting Dump Camp was showing increasing signs of instability as it approached the edge of the pack. Cracks appeared and widened with alarming frequency, and the constant movement of the ice created pressure ridges and open leads that changed the landscape around them from hour to hour. Ernest made the decision that would either save them all or kill them in the attempt. They would launch the boats at the first opportunity and attempt to reach land by navigating through the pack ice to open water, then sailing across the storm-tossed Southern Ocean to the nearest known land. It was a plan that required perfect execution under conditions that made perfection nearly impossible, but it was also their only remaining chance of survival. The final night at Dump Camp was spent in preparation for a journey that every man understood might be his last. Equipment was checked and rechecked, supplies were distributed with mathematical precision, and each crew member reviewed his responsibilities for the boat launch and the sea journey that would follow. There was little conversation. Men who had talked constantly during their months of waiting now seemed to understand that words were inadequate for what lay ahead. Ernest made his final tour of the camp as the Antarctic dawn broke over their ice floe, checking on each man's condition and offering whatever encouragement seemed appropriate for the ordeal that awaited them. Some men were clearly frightened, staring at the dark water that represented both salvation and potential death. Others showed the calm acceptance of professional seamen who had always known that their lives might depend on small boats and heavy seas. All of them understood that their survival now depended not on patience and endurance, but on seamanship and luck in equal measure. The boats were loaded with supplies calculated to sustain 28 men for perhaps 2 weeks. Enough time to reach land if conditions were favorable, but not enough to survive extended delays or navigational errors. Food was rationed to the absolute minimum, with most of the space reserved for fresh water, and the equipment needed to keep the boats functional in seas that could destroy them with a single large wave. Frank Hurley made his final selection of photographic plates, choosing the images that best documented their extraordinary ordeal and abandoning the rest to the ice that had been their prison for so many months. The plates he saved were wrapped in waterproof containers and distributed among the 3 boats, ensuring that even if some were lost, their story would survive to be told to the world. As the moment approached for their departure from the ice that had sustained them through their longest ordeal, Ernest gathered his men for what might be their final meeting as castaways. His words, recorded by several expedition members, captured both the magnitude of the challenge ahead and his unshakable confidence in their ability to meet it. Gentlemen, we are about to embark upon a journey that will test everything we have learned about seamanship, navigation, and survival. The ocean ahead is among the most dangerous on Earth, and our boats are small craft facing conditions that have destroyed much larger vessels. But I have complete confidence that we shall reach safety because I have complete confidence in the men who will sail with me." The boats were dragged to the edge of their ice floe, where dark water lapped against the frozen edge of their world. The sound of waves against ice, the first they had heard since the Endurance was trapped, seemed impossibly strange after months of silence broken only by wind and the grinding of pressure ridges. One by one, the boats were launched into the dark water of the Weddell-Sea. The James Caird went first, with Worsley at the tiller and his crew positioned according to the plan they had rehearsed countless times. The Dudley Docker followed, Tom Crean's steady voice calling encouragement to his men as they settled into their positions. Finally, the Stancomb Wills slid into the water with Ernest at the helm, looking back once at the ice floe that had been their home and their prison. Behind them lay the broken pack ice that had held them captive for over a year. Ahead lay the open ocean, where their small boats would face waves 30 feet high and storms that could sink them in moments. But for the first time since the Endurance had been trapped, they were no longer passengers on a journey controlled by ice and current. They were sailors again, masters of their own fate with Ernest Shackleton's seamanship and determination as their guide toward whatever salvation the Southern Ocean might offer to 28 men in 3 small boats at the bottom of the world. Their first day on the open water shattered any romantic notions about the freedom of leaving the ice behind. The Weddell-Sea, liberated from its frozen surface, revealed itself as one of the most savage bodies of water on Earth. Waves 20 feet high rolled beneath their tiny boats, lifting them to terrifying crests before dropping them into valleys where the horizon disappeared entirely behind walls of dark water. The wind, no longer muffled by the pack ice, screamed across the surface with a ferocity that made conversation impossible and turned every moment at the oars into a battle for survival. Frank Worsley, commanding the James Caird, proved his mastery of small boat handling within the first hour of their departure. The largest of their 3 boats, the James Caird, was also the most seaworthy, but even she was dwarfed by the Southern Ocean swells that threatened to overwhelm her with every wave. Worsley's crew, including the expedition's photographer Frank Hurley and the steadfast Tom Crean, worked with desperate efficiency, bailing water as fast as it poured over their gunwales, while Worsley fought to keep their bow pointed into the waves that could swamp them in an instant. The Dudley Docker, under Tom Crean's command, faced even greater challenges. Smaller than the James Caird and loaded with supplies that left little freeboard, she rode dangerously low in the water, shipping spray with every wave that broke over her bow. Crean's crew included some of the expedition's less experienced sailors, men whose enthusiasm had been tempered by months of hardship and who now faced the reality that their lives depended on seamanship skills they were still learning under conditions that offered no mercy for mistakes. But it was Ernest's boat, the Stancomb Wills, that faced the greatest danger. The smallest of their 3 craft, she had been overloaded with supplies and men in an attempt to ensure that no one was left behind on the ice. Every wave that struck her sent water cascading over her sides, and her crew spent more time bailing than rowing as they struggled to keep their fragile vessel afloat in seas that seemed determined to claim them all. Ernest's seamanship during these first crucial hours established the rhythm that would keep all 3 boats alive through the ordeals ahead. Using hand signals and shouted commands that could barely be heard over the roar of wind and waves, he coordinated their movements to ensure that the boats stayed within supporting distance of each other while avoiding the collisions that could sink them all. When the Stancomb Wills began taking on water faster than her crew could bail it out, Ernest signaled for the other boats to close formation, allowing them to transfer some of her load and lighten her enough to remain seaworthy. The physical demands of rowing in heavy seas pushed the weakened men to the edge of collapse within hours of leaving the ice. These were not the strong, well-fed sailors who had departed London aboard the Endurance, but survivors who had been living on starvation rations for months and whose strength had been sapped by cold, hardship, and the accumulated stress of their ordeal. Yet somehow they found the reserves of energy needed to pull their oars hour after hour, driven by the knowledge that any slackening of effort might mean death for all of them. Dr. Macklin, rowing in the James Caird, observed the medical crisis developing among the crews with growing alarm. Men were showing symptoms of exhaustion that went beyond normal fatigue. The glassy-eyed stare of bodies pushed past their limits, the trembling hands that could barely grip an oar, the labored breathing that indicated hearts struggling to pump blood through systems running on empty. But there was no possibility of rest, no chance to recover from their exertions. The Southern Ocean demanded constant vigilance and effort, and any boat that failed to maintain its battle against the waves would be overwhelmed within minutes. The cold was perhaps worse than the physical exhaustion. Spray from the breaking waves soaked every man within minutes of departure, and their clothes, already inadequate for polar conditions, became sodden. Freezing shells that conducted heat away from their bodies faster than their metabolisms could replace it. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency, leaving men struggling to grip their oars with hands that no longer responded to their commands. But Ernest had anticipated this crisis during their months of preparation at dump camp. He had organized a system of hot drinks that could be prepared on small stoves balanced precariously in the boat's sterns, and these steaming cups of cocoa and tea became lifelines that kept the men functional during their darkest hours. The logistics of boiling water in small boats tossed by heavy seas required constant attention and created additional dangers. Scalding liquid could cause serious burns, and the open flames posed a fire risk that could destroy their boats. But the psychological and physical benefits justified the risks. Navigation in the storm-tossed boats presented challenges that tested even Worsley's legendary skills. The constant motion made it nearly impossible to take accurate sun sights, and the overcast skies often blocked the sun entirely for hours at a time. Dead reckoning became their primary method of navigation, but estimating speed and direction while being tossed by waves and pushed by currents required a level of intuition that bordered on the supernatural. Worsley's solution was to maintain a running estimate of their position based on multiple factors: the direction and strength of the wind, the set of the waves, the color and temperature of the water, and the subtle signs that indicated their proximity to land or ice. His estimates would later prove remarkably accurate, but during the boat journey itself, the crew had only his confidence to sustain their faith that they were actually making progress towards safety, rather than being carried farther into the empty ocean. The first night at sea tested their endurance in ways that none of them had anticipated. During their months on the ice, they had grown accustomed to the relative security of sleeping on a stable, if cold, surface. Now they faced the prospect of trying to rest in boats that never stopped moving, where a moment's inattention could result in being swept overboard by a breaking wave. Sleep became impossible. They could only hope for brief periods of exhausted unconsciousness between the crises that demanded their full attention. Ernest established a watch system that ensured constant vigilance while allowing some men to rest. But the definition of rest in their circumstances bore little resemblance to normal recovery. Men would huddle in the bottom of the boats, shivering in their wet clothes while spray continued to soak them, and the constant motion made any comfortable position impossible. The lucky ones might achieve a few minutes of genuine sleep before being awakened by a wave larger than the rest, or a crisis that required all hands at the oars. The boat's separation became a constant source of anxiety as the hours passed. In calm conditions, they could have stayed within easy hailing distance, but the heavy seas and poor visibility meant that the boats would sometimes lose sight of each other for terrifying periods. Ernest's greatest fear was that one of the boats might be overwhelmed by a large wave and sink before the others could come to their assistance, but the practical reality was that rescue would be nearly impossible in the conditions they were facing. Each boat crew developed its own rhythm and personality as they adapted to their desperate circumstances. The James Caird, with Worsley's steady leadership and experienced sailors like Tom Crean, maintained a disciplined efficiency that inspired confidence despite their precarious situation. The men worked together with the smooth coordination of a crew that understood their business, and their boat made steady progress through conditions that would have challenged much larger vessels. The Dudley Docker, under Tom Crean's command, compensated for her crew's relative inexperience with extraordinary determination and mutual support. Crean's natural leadership and unshakable calm proved perfect for men who needed encouragement rather than orders, and his crew responded with efforts that surprised even themselves. When exhaustion made rowing impossible, they found the strength to continue. When fear threatened to paralyze them, they found courage in their captain's steady presence. But it was in the Stancomb Wills that Ernest's leadership was most crucial. The smallest boat carried some of the expedition's most difficult personalities, men whose pride and independence had served them well during the static phases of their ordeal, but who now chafed at the absolute authority that survival at sea required. Harry McNish, the carpenter whose skills had been invaluable but whose disposition remained challenging, required constant management to maintain the discipline that their survival demanded. Ernest's handling of these personality conflicts while simultaneously managing the navigation and seamanship required for survival demonstrated leadership abilities that transcended normal human limitations. He could not afford to lose his temper, show favoritism, or allow personal conflicts to interfere with the life and death decisions that faced them every hour. Every man in his boat had to pull his weight, literally and figuratively, and those who could not be inspired had to be compelled through the force of Ernest's will and the logic of their shared mortality. The second day brought conditions that made their first day seem pleasant by comparison. The wind increased to gale force, creating waves that towered 40 feet above their tiny boats and threatened to overwhelm them with each passing crest. The spray no longer came in intermittent splashes, but as constant sheets of freezing water that soaked everything in the boats and made bailing a continuous, desperate activity. Hypothermia became their most immediate enemy, more dangerous than the waves because it was invisible until too late. Men whose core body temperature dropped too low would become confused, clumsy, and ultimately unable to contribute to their own survival. Ernest watched his crews with the vigilance of a doctor monitoring critical patients, looking for the subtle signs that indicated when a man was losing his battle against the cold. The treatment for hypothermia in their circumstances was brutally simple. Keep the affected man moving, get hot liquid into him if possible, and share body heat when necessary. But implementing these treatments in boats tossed by heavy seas required a level of care and attention that pushed their already overtaxed resources to the breaking point. Every man saved from hypothermia was one less oar in the water, one less pair of hands for bailing, one less contributor to their collective effort to stay alive. Food became another critical factor in their survival equation. Their supplies had been calculated for a journey of perhaps a week, but the severe conditions were slowing their progress and increasing their caloric needs at the same time. Each meal became a careful balance between providing enough nutrition to maintain the men's strength and preserving supplies for the unknown duration of their journey. Ernest made the agonizing decision to reduce their rations even further, cutting portions to barely above starvation levels while maintaining the illusion of regular meals. The psychological importance of eating at scheduled times, however meager the portions, helped maintain morale and created a structure around which the men could organize their increasingly desperate existence. The boat's equipment began showing the strain of constant use under impossible conditions. Oars cracked under the stress of fighting heavy seas, requiring repairs that had to be accomplished while continuing to row. The sails, when conditions allowed their use, developed tiers that let precious wind escape while creating additional stress on the remaining fabric. Most critically, the boats themselves began showing signs of damage, loose planks that let in additional water, worn fittings that threatened to fail at crucial moments, and stress damage that weakened their structural integrity. Harry McNish's skills as a carpenter became crucial to their survival, as he improvised repairs using materials salvaged from their supplies and tools that were never designed for use in storm-tossed boats. His ability to strengthen a cracked oar with strips of wood and wire, or to plug a leak with oakum and canvas, meant the difference between boats that remained seaworthy and vessels that would sink beneath them. But McNish's value as a craftsman continued to be balanced against his difficulty as a crew member. The harsh conditions and constant stress had not improved his disposition, and Ernest found himself managing both the technical challenges of their situation and the human drama of keeping 28 desperate men focused on survival rather than personal grievances. The crisis came on their third day at sea, when the Stancomb Wills began taking on water faster than her crew could bail it out. A plank in her hull had worked loose under the constant pounding of the waves, creating a leak that threatened to sink the boat within hours. Ernest faced the prospect of losing a third of his men unless immediate action was taken to repair the damage. The repair required bringing the 3 boats together in conditions that made such maneuvering extremely dangerous. A collision between the boats could sink them all, but without the tools and materials from the other boats, the Stancomb Wills could not be saved. Ernest coordinated the delicate operation with the skill of a naval commander, using voice signals and careful seamanship to bring the boats within working distance while avoiding the collisions that would doom them all. McNish's repair of the Stancomb Wills under these conditions was a masterpiece of improvised seamanship. Working from the Dudley docker while the damaged boat pitched and rolled beside him, he managed to drive Oakham into the loose plank and secure it with a patch that would hold long enough to get them to land. The repair took hours, during which all 3 boats were vulnerable to being swamped by large waves, but the alternative was certain death for 9 men. As the boats separated again and resumed their desperate journey, Ernest reflected on the mathematics of their survival. They had been at sea for 3 days, and their progress toward land was slower than he had hoped. Their water supplies were running dangerously low, rationed to amounts that barely sustained life. Most critically, the physical condition of his men was deteriorating at a rate that would soon make them incapable of the effort required to keep the boats afloat. Yet Ernest maintained the confident demeanor that had sustained his men through every crisis of their ordeal. When crew members looked to him for signs of doubt or despair, they saw only the calm determination of a leader who had never lost faith in their eventual survival. His evening talks, shouted over the roar of wind and waves, continued to focus on their destination and the lives they would return to rather than the hardships they were enduring. "Tomorrow we shall see land," he told them on their 4th night at sea, though privately he knew that their navigation was largely guesswork and their destination might still be days away. But the men needed hope more than accuracy, and Ernest's certainty became their anchor in a sea of doubt and fear. The 4th day brought the first signs that their ordeal might be approaching its end. Seabirds appeared overhead, species that indicated proximity to land rather than the open ocean wanderers they had seen during their first days at sea. The water color began changing from the deep blue of the open ocean to the greenish tint that suggested shallower depths and nearby land. Most significantly, floating kelp appeared in the water around them, torn from rocky shores by the same storms that were making their journey such a torment. Worsley's navigation proved its accuracy when, through a brief break in the clouds, he was able to take a sun sight that confirmed their approximate position. They were indeed approaching land. Though the exact location and the conditions they might find there remained unknown, the site that had seemed impossibly distant when they first launched their boats was now perhaps hours away. But their approach to land brought new dangers that were potentially more deadly than the open ocean they were leaving behind. Rocky coasts in the Southern Ocean were notorious ship killers, surrounded by reefs and battered by surf that could destroy their small boats in moments. Even if they successfully navigated to shore, they might find themselves on a coast so hostile that landing would be impossible, forcing them to remain at sea until their boats were finally overwhelmed by the conditions they had fought for so long. Ernest's seamanship during their approach to land required split-second decisions based on incomplete information and constantly changing conditions. The shore appeared and disappeared through fog and spray, revealing tantalizingly brief glimpses of beaches that might offer salvation or cliffs that promised only destruction. The sound of surf grew louder as they drew closer, but whether it indicated safe landing beaches or deadly rocks remained a mystery until they were close enough to see the details that would determine their fate. The 3 boats maintained formation as they searched for a landing site, their crews scanning the shore for any sign of a beach where they might safely land without being destroyed by the surf. The coast they were approaching was forbidding, mostly steep cliffs broken by occasional coves that might or might not offer refuge from the waves that could dash their boats to pieces against the rocks. When they finally spotted what appeared to be a possible landing site, Ernest faced another crucial decision. The beach was narrow and backed by cliffs with surf that looked dangerous but not impossible for boats handled by skilled seamen. They could attempt to land here, with all the risks that entailed, or continue searching for a safer landing site while their strength continued to ebb and their boats deteriorated under the constant pounding of the waves. The decision was made for them when the wind began driving them toward the shore faster than they could row away from it. They would land here or be wrecked against the rocks. There were no other alternatives. Ernest signaled the other boats to prepare for landing, and 20 gate men who had not felt solid ground beneath their feet for over a year prepared to entrust their lives to the breaking waves that stood between them and salvation. The landing was chaos, controlled chaos guided by Ernest's commands and the seamanship skills that had kept them alive through their ocean ordeal, but chaos nonetheless. The James Caird, as the largest and most seaworthy boat, went first, Worsley timing his approach to coincide with the wave cycle that offered the best chance of reaching shore without being swamped by the surf. The boat rode a large wave toward the beach, her crew pulling desperately at their oars to maintain steerage way as the wave broke beneath them and drove them toward the rocky shore at tremendous speed. For a moment it seemed they would be dashed against the rocks that lined the beach, but Worsley's skill and his crew's strength brought them through the surf zone and onto the blessed solidity of land, the first solid ground any of them had felt since abandoning the Endurance months before. The other boats followed, each landing a separate drama of seamanship and luck as their weakened crews fought to bring their vessels safely through surf that could destroy them in moments. The Dudley Docker landed successfully, her crew stumbling onto the beach with the unsteady gait of men who had forgotten how to walk on surfaces that did not move beneath their feet. The Stancomb Wills came last, damaged but still afloat, her crew too exhausted to celebrate their survival until they had dragged their boat beyond the reach of the waves that had nearly claimed them all. 28 men stood on a beach at the bottom of the world, soaked, exhausted, and barely alive, but together and on solid ground for the first time in over a year. Behind them lay the ocean that had tested every skill they possessed and found them sufficient to the challenge. Ahead lay an unknown land that would present its own tests of endurance and survival. But for the moment they were safe, and they were together, and Ernest Shackleton had accomplished what no one had thought possible. He had brought every man under his command through an ordeal that should have killed them all. As they pulled their boats above the high water mark and began the process of establishing their first camp on solid ground, Ernest allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had reached land, but their ordeal was far from over. They were castaways on a remote island with limited supplies and no certain prospect of rescue, but they were alive, and they were together. And as long as those conditions remained true, Ernest knew they could survive whatever challenges lay ahead. The adventure was about to enter its final, most desperate phase. The beach beneath their feet felt impossibly stable after months of constant motion, yet several men found themselves swaying as they tried to walk, their bodies still expecting the deck to rise and fall beneath them. Ernest watched his crew with the practiced eye of a commander assessing his resources, cataloging who was still strong enough for the work ahead and who would need time to recover from their ordeal at sea. The land they had reached was Elephant Island, a desolate outcrop of rock and ice in the South Atlantic that offered shelter from the immediate fury of the Southern Ocean, but little else in the way of comfort or resources. The beach where they had landed was perhaps 100 yards long, backed by cliffs that rose vertically from the narrow strip of gravel and boulders that would have to serve as their home until rescue could be arranged. Dr. Macklin moved among the men with urgent efficiency, treating cases of severe frostbite, exhaustion, and exposure that had developed during their boat journey. Several crew members were showing signs of serious hypothermia, their core body temperatures dangerously low despite their survival of the ocean crossing. Others bore injuries from the constant battle with heavy seas, cuts from sharp ice, burns from the boat stoves, and the deep muscle strains that came from rowing beyond the limits of human endurance. But the most serious medical case was Perce Blackborough, the expedition's youngest member, whose feet had been severely frostbitten during their time at sea. Macklin's examination revealed damage so extensive that amputation might be necessary to prevent gangrene from spreading through the young man's system. The prospect of performing surgery under their primitive conditions, with improvised instruments and no proper anesthetic, highlighted the desperate nature of their situation even after reaching the apparent safety of land. Ernest's immediate priorities were shelter, fresh water, and a secure camp that could protect 28 men from the Antarctic weather while he organized their rescue. The narrow beach offered little protection from the winds that swept across the island with undiminished fury, and their tents, already worn from months of use on the ice, would provide only minimal shelter from the elements that could kill them as surely as the ocean they had just escaped. Frank Wild proved invaluable in organizing the camp, his experience with polar conditions and natural leadership ability making him the perfect deputy for the practical work of survival. Under his direction, the men established a windbreak using their overturned boats and salvaged materials, creating a small pocket of relative calm where they could set up their tents and organize their meager supplies. The search for fresh water became an immediate priority that revealed both the promise and the limitations of their new refuge. The island had streams of meltwater running from its glaciated interior, providing the fresh water they desperately needed after days of rationed supplies at sea. But the water sources were unpredictable, subject to freezing during cold snaps and to contamination from the wildlife that shared the island with them. Food remained their most critical concern. Their supplies from the boat journey were nearly exhausted, calculated for a voyage that was supposed to last days rather than the extended ordeal they had actually endured. The island offered some resources: seals that hauled out on the beaches, penguins that nested in the rocky areas above the shore, and various forms of marine life that could supplement their dwindling stores. But hunting under their weakened conditions, with improvised equipment and in harsh weather, would be a constant challenge that demanded both skill and luck. The psychological impact of reaching land was complex and sometimes contradictory. Men who had maintained their spirits through months of desperate circumstances now faced a different kind of despair as they realized that their ordeal was far from over. The island was uninhabited, rarely visited by ships, and so remote that rescue might be months away, if it came at all. They had survived the immediate crisis of the boat journey only to face the prospect of slow starvation on a windswept rock at the bottom of the world. Ernest understood that this psychological crisis was as dangerous as any physical threat they had faced. Hope deferred could break men's spirits more effectively than cold or hunger, and he needed to provide his crew with a concrete plan for rescue that would sustain their morale through whatever challenges lay ahead. The solution he proposed was characteristically bold and desperate. He would take a small crew in the James Caird, the most seaworthy of their 3 boats, and attempt to reach South Georgia Island, where he knew there was a whaling station that could organize their rescue. The plan was audacious to the point of seeming impossible. South Georgia lay 800 miles away across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, and the James Caird, while sturdy, was only 22 feet long, a tiny craft to pit against the storms and waves of the Southern Ocean. The navigation would have to be perfect, the seamanship flawless, and the weather cooperative enough to allow such a small boat to survive the crossing. A single mistake, a moment of inattention, or an unlucky encounter with bad weather would mean the death of the crew and the abandonment of the 22 men waiting on Elephant Island. But Ernest had considered all the alternatives and found them wanting. No rescue ship would think to look for them on Elephant Island, which was not even on most charts of Antarctic waters. Their supplies would not last through another Antarctic winter, and the island's harsh conditions would likely claim lives long before any chance rescue might discover them. The boat journey to South Georgia was desperately dangerous, but it was also their only realistic hope of salvation. The selection of the James Caird's crew required careful consideration of both technical skills and psychological resilience. Frank Worsley was an obvious choice. His navigation had brought them safely through their previous boat journey, and his seamanship skills would be essential for handling the small boat in heavy seas. Tom Crean was selected for his legendary endurance and unshakable calm under pressure. Timothy McCarthy was chosen for his strength and reliability, while Harry McNish was included both for his skills as a carpenter and to remove his potentially disruptive influence from the men who would remain on Elephant Island. Vincent, the expedition's cook, completed the crew of 6 men who would risk everything in a desperate gamble for rescue. The preparation of the James Caird for her epic voyage required modifications that pushed McNish's carpentry skills to their absolute limits. The boat needed to be strengthened to withstand the pounding of heavy seas, while also being modified to carry the supplies necessary for a journey that might last weeks. A canvas and wood decking was constructed to keep the boat from being swamped by breaking waves, but this modification also created a cramped, dangerous space where men would have to work in conditions that barely allowed movement. Frank Wild would command the 22 men remaining on Elephant Island, establishing a routine that would maintain morale and preserve life until rescue arrived. His instructions from Ernest were simple but comprehensive. Keep the men alive, maintain discipline, and be ready to signal any ship that might appear on the horizon. The psychological burden of this responsibility was enormous. Wild would have to sustain hope among men who might wait months for rescue that might never come. The departure of the James Caird on April 24, 1916 was one of the most emotional moments of the entire expedition. 22 men stood on the beach, watching 6 of their companions sail away into an ocean that had already tested them beyond their limits. Everyone understood that they might never see each other again. The boat crew might perish in the crossing, or the men on Elephant Island might succumb to starvation and exposure before rescue could be organized. Ernest's farewell to the men he was leaving behind revealed both his confidence in their eventual rescue and his understanding of the terrible responsibility he was placing on their shoulders. "I shall return," he told them, with the absolute certainty that had sustained them through every crisis of their ordeal. "Keep the camp together, maintain your health, and be ready to board the rescue ship when it arrives. Mr. Wild will command in my absence, and I expect every man to give him the same loyalty you have given me." The James Caird's departure from the beach required perfect timing and seamanship as Worsley guided the heavily loaded boat through the surf that could dash her to pieces against the rocks. The 6 men aboard were crowded into a space barely large enough for 3, surrounded by supplies and equipment that left little room for movement. As the boat cleared the surf zone and headed into the open ocean, Ernest looked back once at the figures on the beach, knowing that their survival depended entirely on his ability to navigate 800 miles of the world's most dangerous waters and organize a rescue before it was too late. The Southern Ocean greeted the James Caird with conditions that made their previous boat journey seem like a pleasant sailing excursion. Waves 40 feet high rolled beneath the tiny craft, lifting her to dizzying heights before dropping her into valleys where the horizon disappeared entirely behind walls of water. The wind reached hurricane force, creating conditions where survival became a moment-by-moment struggle against forces that could overwhelm them in seconds. Worsley's navigation in the confined, constantly moving space of the James Caird required skills that bordered on the superhuman. Taking accurate sun sights while being tossed by heavy seas was nearly impossible, and the overcast skies often denied him even the brief glimpses of the sun that might have confirmed their position. Dead reckoning became their primary method of navigation, but estimating speed and direction while fighting for their lives in breaking seas required intuition and experience that few navigators possessed. The physical conditions aboard the James Caird tested human endurance in ways that defied description. The 6 men were packed into a space that allowed no comfortable position, surrounded by equipment that shifted and crashed with every wave. The canvas decking that protected them from being swamped also trapped them in a cramped, wet hell where movement was restricted and the air grew foul with the smell of unwashed bodies and seasickness. Sleep became impossible in any meaningful sense. The boat's violent motion made rest nearly impossible, and the constant danger meant that someone always had to be alert for the waves that could destroy them. The men developed a system of brief, exhausted unconsciousness while their companions maintained watch, but true rest was a luxury they could not afford. Food and water were rationed to amounts that barely sustained life, calculated to last for the duration of their crossing but providing no margin for delays or emergencies. Each meal became a ceremony of exact division, with hungry men watching every movement to ensure that no one received even a morsel more than his fair share. The psychological stress of constant hunger, combined with their desperate circumstances, created tensions that had to be carefully managed to prevent conflicts that could destroy their chances of survival. The worst crisis came on their 10th day at sea, when hurricane-force winds created conditions that pushed even their remarkable seamanship to its absolute limits. Waves 60 feet high towered above their tiny boat, and the wind created a hellish environment where spray became horizontal streams of water that made breathing difficult and vision nearly impossible. It was during this storm that Ernest demonstrated the leadership qualities that had sustained his men through every crisis of their ordeal. While others bailed frantically to keep the boat afloat, or fought to maintain steerage way in the impossible conditions, Ernest maintained the calm confidence that had become their anchor in every storm. His voice, raised above the howling wind, continued to direct their efforts and remind them of their destination and the men waiting for rescue on Elephant Island. Harry McNish's carpentry skills proved crucial once again when the constant pounding began opening seams in the boat's hull. Working in conditions that made precise craftsmanship nearly impossible, he managed to keep the James Caird watertight through repairs that had to be accomplished while fighting the storm that threatened to destroy them. His dedication to his craft, despite his personal conflicts with Ernest's authority, exemplified the way that individual skills and collective determination combined to make survival possible under impossible circumstances. The 14th day brought signs that their navigation had been accurate and their ordeal might be approaching its end. Seabirds appeared overhead in numbers that indicated proximity to land, and floating kelp suggested that they were approaching the waters around South Georgia. But their approach to the island brought new dangers that were potentially more deadly than the open ocean they were leaving behind. South Georgia's coast was notorious among seamen as a ship killer, surrounded by reefs and battered by surf that could destroy vessels much larger than their tiny boat. The island was also mountainous and frequently shrouded in fog, making navigation extremely difficult and creating conditions where they might pass within miles of safety without ever seeing the land that could save them. Worsley's skill as a navigator was tested to its absolute limits as he attempted to find their position and guide them to a safe landing on an island that appeared and disappeared through fog and spray. The landmarks he had studied on charts were difficult to identify through the harsh conditions, and a single navigational error could carry them past the island entirely, leaving them to die in the empty ocean beyond. The landing at King Haakon Bay on South Georgia's remote southern coast was another masterpiece of seamanship under impossible conditions. The bay offered some protection from the full fury of the Southern Ocean, but the surf was still dangerous enough to destroy their boat if they made any mistake in their approach. Worsley timed their final approach to coincide with the wave cycle that offered the best chance of reaching shore safely, and the 6 men who had shared the cramped quarters of the James Caird for 16 days finally felt solid ground beneath their feet. But reaching South Georgia was only the first step in organizing the rescue of the men waiting on Elephant Island. The whaling stations that could provide assistance were on the island's northern coast, separated from their landing site by unmapped mountains that had never been crossed by human beings. The interior of South Georgia was a wilderness of glaciers, crevasses, and peaks that could kill them as surely as the ocean they had just conquered. Ernest's decision to attempt the crossing of South Georgia with Tom Crean and Frank Worsley, while leaving the other 3 men at their landing site, reflected his understanding that their rescue mission could not be delayed by the time it would take to recover from their boat journey. Every day that passed was another day that the men on Elephant Island grew weaker and closer to the point where rescue might come too late to save them. The crossing of South Georgia became the final test of endurance for men who had already been pushed beyond normal human limits. The island's interior was a landscape of knife-edge ridges, hidden crevasses, and ice falls that could crush them beneath tons of falling ice. They climbed without proper equipment, navigated without maps, and pushed themselves forward on reserves of strength and determination that seemed to come from sources beyond their physical bodies. For 36 hours, Ernest, Crean, and Worsley made their way across terrain that no human beings had ever seen. Guided only by their compass and their desperate need to reach the whaling station at Stromness before their strength gave out entirely. They climbed ridges that seemed impossible to scale, descended slopes where a single slip would mean death, and navigated around crevasses that could swallow them without trace. The moment when they finally heard the steam whistle of the whaling station at Stromness was one of the most emotional of their entire ordeal. The sound represented civilization, rescue, and the end of their desperate journey across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. But it also meant that their mission was nearly complete. The men waiting on Elephant Island would soon be rescued, and the story of their survival would be told to a world that had given them up for dead. The arrival of Ernest Shackleton at the Stromness whaling station on May 20th, 1916, created a sensation among the Norwegian whalers who had thought him dead for over a year. The three men who stumbled into the station were barely recognizable as human beings. Bearded, filthy, and wearing clothes that were more patches than original fabric, but their eyes still burned with the determination that had carried them through their impossible journey. And their first words were not about their own suffering, but about the 22 men waiting for rescue on Elephant Island. The organization of the rescue expedition tested Ernest's diplomatic and persuasive skills as severely as any physical challenge he had faced. The Norwegian whaling captain who agreed to attempt the rescue understood the dangers involved. Elephant Island lay in waters filled with pack ice and icebergs, and any ship attempting to reach it risked being trapped by the same conditions that had claimed the Endurance. But Ernest's reputation and his obvious concern for his men convinced the Norwegians to make the attempt. The rescue of Frank Wild and the 21 survivors on Elephant Island on August 30th, 1916, after 105 days of waiting, was a moment of triumph that justified every risk Ernest had taken and every hardship they had all endured. The men who had maintained their camp and their discipline through months of uncertainty were finally vindicated in their faith that their leader would return for them. Not a single man had been lost during their entire ordeal, a feat of leadership and survival that had no precedent in the history of polar exploration. The return of the Endurance survivors to civilization created a worldwide sensation, but their story was overshadowed by the Great War that was consuming Europe and claiming lives on an industrial scale. The intimate drama of 28 men fighting for survival at the bottom of the world seemed almost quaint compared to the mechanized slaughter occurring on the Western Front. Yet their story of endurance, leadership, and the refusal to abandon hope under the most desperate circumstances offered a different kind of inspiration to a world that desperately needed reminders of human resilience and nobility. Ernest Shackleton never achieved his dream of crossing the Antarctic continent. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition failed in its stated objective and returned without any significant geographical or scientific discoveries. By the conventional measures of exploration success, the entire enterprise was a complete failure that had accomplished nothing except to demonstrate the limitations of human ambition when confronted by natural forces beyond control or prediction. But the true measure of the Endurance expedition was never geographical, it was human. Ernest had promised to bring his men home alive, and he had fulfilled that promise despite circumstances that should have made it impossible. In an age when exploration was often measured by territories claimed and records broken, the Endurance expedition offered a different definition of success: the simple but profound achievement of keeping faith with the men who had trusted their lives to his leadership. The lessons of the Endurance expedition extended far beyond the realm of polar exploration. Ernest's leadership through their ordeal became a template for management under crisis conditions, studied by military commanders, business leaders, and anyone who faced the challenge of holding groups together when normal systems and structures had broken down. His ability to maintain morale through humor, personal attention, and unwavering confidence in eventual success offered insights into human psychology that remained relevant long after the age of exploration had ended. The expedition's photographer, Frank Hurley, had managed to preserve a remarkable visual record of their ordeal, despite the extreme conditions and the constant threat to their survival. His images of the Endurance being crushed by ice, of men hauling boats across broken pack ice, and of their camps on floating ice floes provided documentary evidence that their story was not exaggerated or embellished. The photographs became iconic representations of human endurance, reproduced in countless books and exhibitions that brought their story to audiences around the world. Frank Wild, who had commanded the men on Elephant Island with such skill and dedication, continued his friendship with Ernest for the rest of their lives. The bond forged between the two men during their months of shared hardship transcended the normal relationships between expedition leaders and their subordinates. Wild's quiet competence and absolute loyalty had been essential to their survival, and Ernest never forgot the debt he owed to the man who had kept his promise to maintain discipline and hope while waiting for rescue that might never have come. Tom Crean returned to Ireland in a hero's welcome. But like many of the expedition members, he found that civilian life could not match the intensity and purpose he had experienced during their Antarctic ordeal. The bonds forged between the crew members remained strong throughout their lives, creating a brotherhood of men who had shared experiences that could never be fully communicated to those who had not endured similar trials. The carpenter, Harry McNish, whose skills had been crucial to their survival but whose personality had created constant friction, received a small pension from expedition funds, but never achieved the recognition that his contributions deserved. His story highlighted the complex nature of group survival, where individual talents and personal conflicts existed in constant tension, and where leadership required the ability to manage both technical challenges and human emotions under extreme stress. The fate of the expedition's dogs, whose systematic destruction had been necessary for the men's survival, remained a source of grief for many of the survivors. These animals had been companions and workers, individual personalities who had shared the hardships and provided emotional support during the darkest periods of their ordeal. Their deaths represented the kind of brutal choices that survival sometimes demands, decisions that haunt those who make them long after the immediate crisis has passed. Dr. Alexander Macklin and Dr. Reginald James, the expedition's physician and physicist, both went on to distinguish careers in their respective fields, but they never forgot the lessons they had learned about human endurance and resilience during their time with Ernest Shackleton. Their medical and scientific training had been valuable during the expedition, but their real education had come from observing how ordinary men could transcend their apparent limitations when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The youngest member of the expedition, Perce Blackborough, recovered from his frostbite injuries and lived to tell his story to generations of listeners who were fascinated by his account of survival at the bottom of the world. His experience as a stowaway who became an essential crew member illustrated the expedition's democratic spirit and Ernest's ability to judge men by their contributions rather than their formal qualifications or social status. Ernest Shackleton himself never fully recovered from the physical and emotional toll of the Endurance expedition. The years of stress, cold, and inadequate nutrition had damaged his health in ways that could not be repaired, and he died of heart failure in 1922 during another Antarctic expedition. He was buried on South Georgia, the island where his greatest feat of navigation and leadership had reached its climax, and where his grave became a pilgrimage site for those who understood the magnitude of what he had accomplished. The ship Endurance herself remained locked in the ice of the Weddell-Sea, her crushed hull gradually sinking beneath the surface as the pack ice continued its slow drift northward. For over a century, she remained one of the most famous shipwrecks never found, her exact location unknown despite numerous attempts to locate the vessel that had carried Ernest and his men on their journey into legend. In 2022, more than a century after she was crushed by the ice, the Endurance was finally discovered by a team of marine archaeologists using advanced underwater vehicles and navigation technology that Ernest could never have imagined. The ship was found in remarkable preservation, her hull crushed but her structure intact, sitting on the floor of the Weddell-Sea like a time capsule from the heroic age of exploration. The discovery of the Endurance brought their story full circle. connecting the modern world with the extraordinary tale of 28 men who refused to surrender to circumstances that should have destroyed them. The ship that had carried them into the ice was still there, waiting beneath the dark waters of the Southern Ocean, a testament to the dreams and ambitions that had driven them to attempt the impossible. Today, when we face our own challenges and wonder whether ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, the story of the Endurance Expedition provides an answer. 28 men, led by a leader who understood that success is sometimes measured not by objectives achieved, but by promises kept, proved that human endurance has no fixed limits. They demonstrated that with proper leadership, mutual support, and refusal to abandon hope, people can survive ordeals that seem designed to destroy them. The advertisement that Ernest Shackleton placed in that London newspaper in 1914 promised hazardous journey, bitter cold, and safe return doubtful. He delivered on all of those promises, but he also provided something that no advertisement could have promised: proof that in the darkest moments, when all seems lost and death appears inevitable, the human spirit can endure, and leaders can emerge who will never abandon those who have trusted them with their lives. In the end, that may be the most important discovery of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, not geographical knowledge or scientific data, but the simple, profound truth that we are capable of far more than we imagine, and that with the right leadership and the right companions, no situation is entirely hopeless. The white silence of Antarctica tested Ernest Shackleton and his men to their absolute limits and found them sufficient to the challenge. Their story endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience: the need to believe that courage and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds, and that leaders exist who will never abandon those who follow them into the unknown. Ernest Shackleton brought 28 men home alive from the bottom of the world, and in doing so, he left us all a little richer in our understanding of what human beings can achieve when they refuse to surrender to despair. The Endurance Expedition failed in its stated mission, but succeeded in something far more important. It proved that the human spirit, properly led and supported, is truly unconquerable. That lesson, forged in the ice and storms of Antarctica, remains as relevant today as it was when Ernest Shackleton first placed his advertisement and began the journey that would define not just his own life, but our understanding of leadership, survival, and the indomitable nature of hope. Before we part ways, I want to express my deepest gratitude that you chose to spend this time exploring one of history's most extraordinary tales of human endurance. If this story of Ernest Shackleton and his crew has moved you, inspired you, or simply reminded you of the remarkable things ordinary people can achieve under extraordinary circumstances, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Michael's Expeditions. We have many more incredible stories of exploration, survival, and human triumph waiting to be discovered together. In our next adventure, we'll journey to the other end of the Earth to follow Roald Amundson's methodical, brilliant race to the South Pole. A very different kind of Antarctic story that reveals how meticulous planning and cultural wisdom can triumph where raw determination meets its limits. Until then, may you carry with you the spirit of Ernest Shackleton, the understanding that leadership means never abandoning those who trust you, and that no situation is hopeless as long as we refuse to surrender our humanity to despair. The white continent still calls to us today, just as it called to Shackleton over a century ago. But thanks to men like him, we know that we can answer that call and return to tell the tale.